one of the biggest late-night hosts in America, a man with millions of viewers, says something so reckless and so cruel that it doesn't just backfire, it pulls the rug out from under him entirely. This isn't about jokes falling flat. This is about trust, credibility, and the moment when even powerful networks decide they can't protect you anymore. Jimmy Kimmel just went too far, and what happened next tells us a lot about the world we live in right now. When the country was still processing a tragic event, the assassination of Charlie Kirk should have been a moment for reflection, maybe even bringing people together in grief. Instead, Jimmy Kimmel decided to turn it into material for his late-night monologue. But this wasn't comedy in any traditional sense. Kimmel stood in front of his audience and essentially spread a completely false narrative. He claimed that Kirk's killer was part of what he called the MAGA gang, suggesting that conservatives were somehow responsible for the death of one of their own prominent voices. Think about that for a moment. A young man had been murdered for his political beliefs, and Kimmel decided to twist that tragedy into a weapon against the very people who were mourning him. The facts, as they came out through police investigations and court documents, painted an entirely different picture. The killer wasn't a right-wing extremist at all. He was actually a radical leftist with strong political motivations that aligned completely opposite to Kirk's message. The evidence was overwhelming: text messages, social media posts, even items engraved on the bullets used in the attack. All of it pointed to someone who hated what Kirk represented and wanted to silence that voice permanently. But Kimmel didn't stop there. In what might have been the most tone-deaf moment of his entire career, he then mocked President Trump's grief over Kirk's death. He compared the president's response to how a 4-year-old mourns a goldfish. Can you imagine? Here was a sitting president expressing genuine sorrow over the assassination of a young American, and Kimmel thought that was material for cheap laughs. Now, I've seen plenty of controversial comedy in my time. I understand that pushing boundaries is part of what comedians do. But what Kimmel did that night wasn't pushing boundaries, it was exploiting genuine tragedy for political points. It was taking a family's grief, a community's loss, and turning it into ammunition against political opponents. That's not comedy. That's something much darker. But the words themselves were just the beginning. What followed shocked even Hollywood insiders. You see, in the old days, a comment like this might have sparked some angry tweets and moved on. The entertainment industry had a pretty reliable pattern. Controversial statements would create a brief storm, networks would issue non-apology apologies, and within a week or two, everyone would move on to the next controversy. The system protected its own, especially when those controversial statements aligned with the prevailing political winds in Hollywood. But something different happened this time. Within hours of Kimmel's monologue airing, Brendan Carr, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, issued a public statement that sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. Now, you have to understand the FCC doesn't usually get involved in late-night comedy disputes. They oversee the technical side of broadcasting, manage spectrum allocations, that sort of thing. For them to speak out about content like this was almost unprecedented. Carr didn't mince words. He called Kimmel's conduct some of the sickest behavior possible and made it clear that the FCC was exploring what actions they might be able to take. More importantly, he reminded everyone about something that many people had forgotten. Broadcast television networks operate under special obligations. They use public airwaves, which means they have responsibilities to serve the public interest that cable networks and streaming services don't have. This wasn't just regulatory posturing either. When the chairman of the FCC starts talking about broadcast licenses and public interest obligations, network executives pay attention. These are billion-dollar operations that depend on maintaining their federal broadcasting licenses. Suddenly, what seemed like just another late-night controversy was being framed as a potential violation of public trust. But the real earthquake came from an unexpected direction. The very broadcasters who had been carrying Kimmel's show for years started backing away. Within days, major broadcast groups that reached tens of millions of American homes began making announcements that would have been unthinkable just months before. Nexstar, which operates more television stations than any other company in America, we're talking about reaching nearly 4 out of every 10 households in the country, announced they would no longer air Jimmy Kimmel live on their ABC. Affiliates. Think about that scale for a moment. In one decision, Kimmel lost access to close to 40% of American television households. Then, Sinclair Broadcasting, another major player, made a similar announcement, but they went a step further that really drove home how dramatically things had shifted. Instead of just dropping Kimmel's show, they announced they would be filling that time slot with a special honoring Charlie Kirk's memory and his mission. They also publicly called on Kimmel to make a substantial donation to Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, as a gesture of accountability. Can you imagine that happening 5 years ago? 10 years ago? A major broadcasting company not only dropping a network show over political content, but then using that same time slot to honor the very person the host had mocked? It was a complete reversal of how these things typically played out. And that's where things get even more interesting, because the network didn't just pause, they pulled the plug. You have to understand what was happening behind the scenes at ABC and Disney during this period. These aren't conservative companies by any stretch of the imagination. Disney, which owns ABC, had been perfectly comfortable with years of anti-Trump content, political comedy that leaned heavily left, and entertainment that reflected Hollywood's progressive values. They weren't making this decision because they suddenly developed conservative sensibilities. No, what happened was much more significant than that. Disney executives were reportedly furious, not because of Kimmel's politics, but because of what his comments represented from a business perspective. Here was a host who had taken a national tragedy and turned it into a liability for the entire network. Sponsors were getting nervous, affiliate stations were openly rebelling, regulatory agencies were asking questions, and all of this was happening around a show that, frankly, wasn't performing well enough to justify this kind of headache. The decision to suspend the show indefinitely came down from the very top levels of Disney's corporate structure. This wasn't some middle manager trying to avoid controversy. This was a calculated business decision made by people who understood that protecting Jimmy Kimmel was no longer worth the cost. And the timing was particularly significant because it sent a message throughout Hollywood that the rules had changed. For decades, the entertainment industry had operated under an assumption that political controversy from the left was generally safe territory. Pushing conservative buttons, mocking traditional values, taking shots at Republican politicians, all of that was not only acceptable, it was often rewarded with praise from industry peers and entertainment media. But what the Kimmel situation demonstrated was that there were now real consequences for going too far. When your comments become so inflammatory that they threaten the business model itself, suddenly the protective shield that the entertainment industry had always provided starts to crack. But it wasn't just about one offensive remark, it tied into something bigger that had been building for years. If you really want to understand why Jimmy Kimmel's career came crashing down so quickly, you need to look at the numbers that were already working against him. The uncomfortable truth that Disney executives had been trying to ignore was that Kimmel's show had been struggling for quite some time before this controversy even erupted. By late 2024, Kimmel was barely pulling in around 1 million viewers per night, and that was on a good night. To put that in perspective, there are individual YouTube channels run by people working out of their bedrooms that get more daily views than Kimmel was getting on a major broadcast network. Meanwhile, over on Fox News, Greg Gutfeld's late night show was consistently drawing over 3 million viewers, more than triple Kimmel's audience. This wasn't just a temporary slump either. The data showed a steady decline over several years, with Kimmel losing viewers at a rate of around 10 to 15% year over year. For a show that costs millions of dollars to produce and requires the support of dozens of high-paid staff members, those numbers represent a serious problem that goes far beyond politics. What made it even worse for ABC was the demographic breakdown of who was still watching. The audience that remained was heavily concentrated in the older, more affluent liberal demographics that advertisers were increasingly moving away from. Meanwhile, the younger viewers that advertisers desperately wanted to reach were getting their comedy and commentary from completely different sources: podcasts, streaming platforms, social media creators who could respond to current events in real time rather than waiting for the next day's television schedule. ABC executives had been quietly looking for an exit strategy for months before the Kirk controversy gave them the perfect opportunity. When you're already hemorrhaging money on a show with declining relevance, and then that show creates a massive public relations crisis that threatens your broader business relationships, the decision becomes pretty straightforward from a corporate perspective. But here's where it gets really interesting, because while Kimmel's ratings were collapsing, conservative-leaning alternatives were experiencing unprecedented growth. Gutfeld's show wasn't just beating Kimmel, it was experiencing year-over-year increases of 20 to 30%, while every other late-night show was declining. The audience was clearly there for comedy and commentary, but they were choosing different voices to provide it. This created a fascinating dynamic in the entertainment industry. For years, Hollywood had operated under the assumption that conservative-leaning content was a niche market with limited appeal. The success of shows like Gutfeld's and the simultaneous failure of traditionally liberal comedy shows was forcing entertainment executives to question some very fundamental assumptions about what American audiences actually wanted. So if ratings were slipping, why did this particular comment trigger the collapse? The answer reveals a deeper cultural shift. The truth is, Jimmy Kimmel's attack on Charlie Kirk's memory wasn't just seen as a bad joke or poor taste. It became symbolic of everything that millions of Americans felt was wrong with mainstream entertainment. Here was a wealthy comedian insulated in Hollywood, using his platform to spread false information about a tragic event in order to score cheap political points against people who were genuinely grieving. For many viewers, this crystallized a feeling they'd been having for years, that late-night television had stopped being about entertainment and had become a weapon in cultural and political battles. The traditional boundaries between news, commentary, and comedy had completely dissolved, leaving audiences feeling like they were being lectured rather than entertained every time they turned on their televisions. What made Kimmel's situation particularly damaging was how easily his claims could be fact-checked. Within hours of his monologue airing, people were sharing police reports, court documents, and verified information that completely contradicted everything he had said. Social media platforms were flooded with corrections, not from partisan sources, but from official law enforcement and judicial proceedings. This created something that had rarely happened in the traditional media era, a late-night host being publicly and definitively proven wrong about major factual claims, not by political opponents, but by objective legal proceedings. The traditional model of television comedy had always relied on the host being able to set the narrative and move on to the next topic before anyone could meaningfully challenge their statements. But in today's information environment, that luxury no longer exists. Even more significantly, the backlash came from unexpected places. Social media personalities who didn't typically align with conservative politics began speaking out about Kimmel's comments. Jeffree Star, a makeup artist and influencer with millions of followers across multiple platforms, used his appearance on Piers Morgan's show to defend Charlie Kirk and criticize the celebration of his death. Here was someone from a completely different demographic and cultural background taking a stand that traditionally would have been seen as politically risky. Star lost around 100,000 followers for speaking out, but he also gained hundreds of thousands of new ones who appreciated his willingness to prioritize basic human decency over political tribalism. This pattern repeated across social media, with creators discovering that audiences were hungry for voices willing to reject the most extreme partisan talking points in favor of more thoughtful perspectives. And that outrage opened the door to something far larger, a reversal of cultural power. What happened to Jimmy Kimmel represents something much bigger than one comedian's downfall. For the first time in decades, we're seeing the entertainment industry's cultural monopoly genuinely challenged in ways that create real consequences for major media figures. Think about how this would have played out a few years ago. The entertainment industry had developed sophisticated systems for weathering these storms. Publicists who could manage narratives, friendly entertainment reporters who would provide sympathetic coverage, and audiences who had limited alternatives if they didn't like what was being offered. But that entire ecosystem has been fundamentally disrupted. When Jimmy Kimmel made his comments about Charlie Kirk, he wasn't just facing criticism from traditional media sources or political opponents. He was facing immediate, sustained pushback from independent creators, podcasters, and social media personalities who could reach audiences directly without going through traditional media gatekeepers. More importantly, these alternative voices could provide context and fact-checking in real time, something that had never been possible during the height of television's cultural dominance. Within hours, people could access police reports, court documents, and verified information that completely contradicted Kimmel's narrative. The traditional advantage that television hosts had, being able to make claims and move on to the next topic before facing meaningful scrutiny, had completely evaporated. This created a perfect storm that the entertainment industry wasn't prepared to handle. Network executives found themselves dealing not just with traditional political controversy, but with a sustained information campaign that was undermining their hosts' credibility in real time. Affiliate stations were fielding calls from viewers who could cite specific evidence contradicting what they had just seen on their network programming. What made this particularly devastating for someone like Kimmel was that his entire brand had been built on appearing informed and morally authoritative. Late-night comedy had evolved beyond simple entertainment. These hosts had positioned themselves as trusted sources of political commentary and cultural guidance. When that credibility gets destroyed by verifiable facts, the entire foundation of the show's appeal collapses. And this brings us to a fascinating historical parallel that I think explains what we're really witnessing here. There was a time when a handful of major television networks could essentially control the national conversation. 3 or 4 executives in New York and Los Angeles could decide what topics Americans would discuss around their dinner tables, which political figures would be taken seriously, and what cultural values would be promoted or ridiculed. That system worked for decades because alternatives were limited. If you wanted entertainment or news, you had to go through these established gatekeepers. But just like how the internet disrupted traditional retail, or how electric vehicles are changing the automotive industry, new technologies and platforms have completely shattered the old media monopoly. For decades, comedians like David Letterman, Jay Leno, and later Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert could shape public narratives with minimal pushback. They had the luxury of time their monologues aired late at night. Most people heard about the content secondhand, if at all, and by the time any criticism might surface, they had already moved on to completely different topics. It was a system that heavily favored the host perspective, whatever that might be. But Donald Trump's rise to prominence changed all of that in ways that the entertainment industry still doesn't fully understand. When Trump began directly challenging media narratives on social media, responding to coverage in real time, and encouraging his supporters to question what they were being told by traditional sources, he essentially broke the old rules of how public discourse was supposed to work. Suddenly, a late-night comedian couldn't make a claim about a political figure without that figure potentially responding directly to millions of followers within hours. The traditional buffer that had existed between entertainment figures and political consequences simply evaporated. And this wasn't just about Trump himself, it was about a broader shift in how information flows through our society. The result has been a cascading series of changes throughout the media landscape that most people in the entertainment industry are still trying to process. Major news organizations that had operated with relative impunity for decades suddenly found themselves facing sustained scrutiny and financial pressure. NPR and PBS, which had long been considered untouchable due to their public funding and prestige, saw their federal support eliminated when their political bias became impossible to ignore. Stephen Colbert, who had built his entire late-night career around anti-Trump content, announced his retirement as his relevance declined, along with his target's prominence. Even mainstream news personalities found themselves having to acknowledge biases that had previously gone unexamined. The protective ecosystem that had shielded liberal media figures from meaningful accountability was crumbling from multiple directions simultaneously, and with legacy media weakened, new players stepped in to claim the throne. This is where I want you to listen closely, because nature abhors a vacuum, especially in the entertainment world. As traditional late-night shows were losing audiences and credibility, alternative voices were experiencing explosive growth that caught almost everyone off guard. Greg Gutfeld's show on Fox News became the perfect example of this shift. Here was a comedian who had been relegated to afternoon cable programming just a few years earlier, suddenly commanding audiences that dwarfed anything the major broadcast networks could generate. His success wasn't accidental. He was providing something that millions of Americans had been craving, but couldn't find anywhere else. Gutfeld offered comedy that didn't constantly lecture his audience about their political beliefs or cultural values. He could make fun of politicians from both parties without it feeling like he was reading from a partisan script. Most importantly, he seemed to actually like his audience, rather than viewing them as people who needed to be educated or corrected. That difference in approach turned out to be enormously significant in terms of building loyalty and trust. But the changes went far beyond traditional television. Independent creators on platforms like YouTube and podcast networks began attracting audiences that rivaled and often exceeded anything the major networks could produce. These creators had advantages that traditional media simply couldn't match. They could respond to current events immediately. They didn't have to worry about corporate sponsors getting nervous about political content. And they could build direct relationships with their audiences without network interference. What made this particularly devastating for someone like Jimmy Kimmel was that these alternative voices weren't just offering different political perspectives. They were often more entertaining, more authentic, and more responsive to what their audiences actually wanted to see. When you can get funnier, more honest commentary from someone working out of their home studio than you can from a multi-million-dollar network production, the traditional advantages of big media start to look pretty meaningless. Even more surprising was how this cultural shift began attracting voices from completely unexpected corners of the entertainment world. Jeffree Star, who built his career in makeup and fashion, suddenly found himself becoming a significant voice in political commentary, simply by being willing to say that celebrating political assassinations was morally wrong, regardless of the victim's political beliefs. Star's appearance on Piers Morgan's show, where he defended Charlie Kirk and criticized the celebration of his death, demonstrated something important about how the cultural landscape has changed. Here was someone with millions of followers across multiple platforms, primarily young people who traditionally wouldn't engage with conservative political content, speaking out against the mainstream entertainment industry's response to a tragedy. The fact that Star lost followers but gained even more new ones for taking that stand reveals something crucial about where American culture is heading. There's a hunger for voices willing to prioritize basic human decency over political tribalism, even when that means challenging the established narratives of their own industries or communities. This pattern has repeated itself across social media and entertainment platforms. Creators who are willing to break from expected political positions, especially when it meant defending basic principles of fairness or accuracy, often found themselves connecting with audiences they had never expected to reach. The rigid ideological categories that had defined entertainment and politics for decades were breaking down in favor of more nuanced, human-centered approaches. Which brings us back to Kimmel, not just one man's downfall, but a symbol of something ending. The lesson that Hollywood is slowly, sometimes painfully learning, is that the era of consequence-free political grandstanding is over. For years, entertainment figures could make outrageous statements, spread questionable information, or mock large segments of the American public with minimal risk to their careers or bottom lines. The industry had developed sophisticated systems for protecting its own, especially when controversial statements aligned with prevailing political winds. But what happened to Jimmy Kimmel represents the collapse of that protective system. When your statements become so inflammatory that they threaten business relationships, when fact-checkers can immediately contradict your claims with verifiable evidence, and when audiences have readily available alternatives that better serve their needs, suddenly the old rules stop applying. This isn't just about conservative versus liberal politics either. What audiences are rejecting is the assumption that they should tolerate being lectured, misled, or insulted by people who are supposed to be entertaining them. The social contract between entertainers and audiences has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer enough to simply be on television or have a major platform. You actually have to earn and maintain your audience's trust and loyalty. Disney's decision to cut ties with Kimmel, despite years of supporting his political commentary, demonstrates how quickly these calculations can change when the business fundamentals shift. Entertainment companies are ultimately businesses, and when a performer becomes more liability than asset, even long-standing relationships and ideological alignments become secondary considerations. The broader lesson extends well beyond late-night comedy. Across Hollywood, performers, writers, and executives are having to reconsider assumptions that had guided their careers for decades. The idea that there's a safe political position that will protect you from controversy has largely evaporated. Instead, success increasingly depends on authenticity, accuracy, and genuine respect for your audience qualities that the old system often discouraged in favor of ideological conformity. And that leads to the real reason behind Kimmel's cancellation, one that should make every entertainer take notice. While the political controversy provided the immediate catalyst for Kimmel's downfall, the deeper truth is that he had already become a liability from a purely business perspective. The harsh reality of entertainment is that talent, political positions, and even controversy can all be forgiven if you're generating profits. But when you stop being profitable and start creating problems, even the most powerful networks will eventually cut their losses. Kimmel's ratings had been in steady decline for years before the Charlie Kirk controversy erupted. His audience was aging, his reach was shrinking, and his cost per viewer was becoming increasingly difficult to justify to corporate executives who have to answer to shareholders and board members. The show was essentially running on institutional momentum rather than actual market demand. When the controversy hit, it provided Disney executives with something they had been quietly seeking for months, a clean exit strategy that didn't make them look like they were simply canceling a show for poor performance. They could frame the decision as taking a principled stand about public responsibility and broadcast standards, rather than admitting that one of their flagship programs had simply become financially unsustainable. This dynamic explains why the industry response was so swift and decisive. In the old days, networks might have weathered significant controversy to protect a profitable show. But when a show is already struggling financially, controversy becomes the final straw, rather than a challenge to overcome. The real lesson here isn't about the power of cancel culture or political correctness. It's about the fundamental economics of entertainment in a rapidly changing media landscape. Audiences have more choices than ever before, and they're increasingly willing to vote with their attention and their wallets when content doesn't meet their expectations. For entertainers who have built their careers around the old model of protected controversy, this represents an existential challenge. The assumption that networks or streaming platforms will shield them from consequences is no longer reliable when those same platforms are facing their own survival pressures in an increasingly competitive marketplace. Jimmy Kimmel's fall signals not just the cultural shift away from traditional late-night comedy, but the financial collapse of a model that once seemed untouchable. When major broadcast networks are willing to abandon expensive productions and established relationships over single controversial incidents, it demonstrates just how precarious the entertainment industry's economics have become. So, what do we take away from all this? It's bigger than Kimmel. It's about the shift happening right now in culture. What we're witnessing with Jimmy Kimmel's cancellation is really a case study in how quickly established institutions can lose their relevance when they stop serving their audiences effectively. For those of us who've lived through major technological and cultural shifts before, there's something familiar about this pattern. It's the same dynamic we've seen play out in industry after industry over the past several decades. The entertainment world operated for generations under certain assumptions: that audiences had limited alternatives, that controversial political statements from the left carried minimal risk, and that established media companies could weather almost any storm through institutional support and industry connections. All of those assumptions have proven to be false in today's environment. What's emerging in their place is something much more responsive to actual audience preferences and much less tolerant of poor performance, regardless of political alignment. This isn't necessarily about conservative versus liberal politics. It's about competence, authenticity, and respect for the people who choose to spend their time and attention on your content. The speed with which Jimmy Kimmel went from protected late-night institution to industry liability demonstrates just how quickly these changes can accelerate once they reach a tipping point. Network executives who had been content to ignore declining ratings and growing audience dissatisfaction suddenly found themselves facing regulatory pressure, affiliate rebellion, and sponsor nervousness all at once. But perhaps most importantly, they discovered that their traditional tools for managing controversy, corporate statements, publicist damage control, friendly entertainment reporters were largely ineffective against sustained criticism from independent voices who could reach audiences directly and provide immediate fact-checking and context. This represents a fundamental shift in how cultural power operates in America. For the first time in decades, establishment media institutions are genuinely vulnerable to grassroots accountability in ways that create real consequences for major figures. The protective barriers that once shielded entertainment elites from the effects of their statements and decisions have largely crumbled. What this means for all of us, especially those who remember when media institutions commanded much more automatic respect and deference, is that we're entering a period of genuine competition in the marketplace of ideas and entertainment. No longer can a handful of executives in New York and Los Angeles determine what the rest of the country will find funny, interesting, or worthy of attention. The new landscape rewards authenticity, accuracy, and genuine connection with audiences over ideological conformity or institutional support. It's messier and more unpredictable than the old system, but it's also more responsive to what people actually want rather than what industry elites think they should want. For viewers, this creates both opportunities and responsibilities. We have access to more diverse voices and perspectives than ever before, but we also need to be more discerning consumers of information and entertainment. The old gatekeepers are gone, which means we all have to become better at evaluating sources and thinking critically about what we're consuming. The Jimmy Kimmel situation ultimately represents the growing pains of this transition. An entertainer who built his career under the old rules discovered that those rules no longer apply, and the industry that once protected him found that protection was no longer economically viable. What emerged from that collision was a clearer picture of how entertainment and media will operate in the years ahead, more competitive, more accountable, and more directly responsive to audience preferences. And now I'd love to hear what you think. Was this cancellation overdue? Do you think late-night comedy lost its way years ago when it became more about political messaging than actual entertainment? Have you found yourself turning away from traditional television in favor of other sources for news and comedy? These changes affect all of us, regardless of our political beliefs, because they're really about whether we want our entertainment and information sources to respect us as intelligent adults or treat us as people who need to be managed and directed. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening behind these headline-grabbing stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends. Because the more people understand these deeper dynamics, the harder it becomes for media giants to hide the truth about why they make the decisions they do. The future belongs to voices that earn trust rather than demand it, and audiences that think for themselves rather than accept what they're told. Jimmy Kimmel's downfall isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of something much more interesting.